Hey everybody, I'm MS Farzan, and in this video, we're going to learn about full-stack web development by building a role-playing game character generator with Mongo, Express, Vue, and Node, also known as the MEVN stack. The prerequisites for this video are simply that you've installed Node.js and MongoDB on your computer. They can require a little bit of configuration, so make sure you've done that before we get started. I'll mention a few things about the configuration for Mongo a little bit later in the video, but it would be great if you already have it installed and working on your machine. So I should also mention that there are a few articles that have really helped in my own understanding of full stack web development and creating web APIs, and I'll link them in the description for this video, as well as a written version of this tutorial that you can follow along if you prefer. Let's get started. So I just have my code editor open here. I'm using Visual Studio. You could use something else, whatever you're most comfortable with. And I also have a command line open that we'll be using quite a bit for our project here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is discuss what it is that we're trying to accomplish with this video. When I say a role-playing game character generator, I'm a tabletop game developer, and I enjoy making apps that have the potential to be useful for tabletop gaming. So I want to create an app that allows us to create characters that this simple app will just have a character name that we input or that the user inputs, and a drop-down menu that they can use to select what profession they are, if they want to be a warrior or a thief or a mage. And when I do that, I want the website that I'm creating, which will be built on Vue, we'll call that the client. I want the client to be able to talk to a server or the backend, what's called an API or an application programming interface. I want the front-end client to be able to talk to my server and say, hey, I created a new character and I want you to save that to a database. And the database is going to be our Mongo database. Then I should be able to not only write to the server, but I want to read from the server, and I want my client to be able to tell my server, hey, can you get all of the records or all of the items that are in the database and display them on screen. So I've got my front-end client, and then I've got a back-end server or API that communicates with my database, and that's going to be the full stack, and that's the scope of this project. If you get stuck at any point, please feel free to just check out all of the code which is available on the GitHub repo, which I'll also include in the description of this video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my coding directory in my command prompt here, and you might have a different command line interface. That's fine. Whatever works for you is fine. So if I just get out of here and go to my coding directory, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a directory, and you can call this whatever you want, but I'll be referring to this folder a lot throughout the tutorial, so you might want to just do the same thing that I'm doing here. I'm going to say make a directory called MEVN character generator. And I'm going to move into that new directory. Very exciting. And so now I have just this empty directory that I haven't done anything with. The first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to install what's called the Vue CLI or Vue command line interface. The Vue CLI is a package that allows me to scaffold a basic Vue project. And if you haven't worked with Vue before, it's worth looking into. I really appreciate it as a JavaScript library that allows you to make dynamic web pages. One could say it's like a competitor to React or similar or Angular or similar libraries or frameworks. But I find it to be a really easy entry point into building dynamic web pages and single page applications. So we're going to go through we're going to build our client with Vue, and I won't presume that this will be your first interaction with Vue. If you haven't worked with Vue before, some of the things I might be doing might be a little bit confusing, so it would be good to just have like a little bit of a tutorial or even just read an article about what Vue does so that you have a grasp on what we're doing here. Otherwise, I think it'll be pretty self-explanatory. So I'm going to say to my package manager, which is npm, npm install global at view/CLI. And of course, if you already have the Vue CLI installed, you probably won't need to do this, but I just want to take you through every step so that you're able to do everything that I'm doing here without getting stuck at any step. And what's great about the Vue CLI is that it will, as we'll see, it will scaffold a project for me so that I don't have to go through the trouble of setting up all the files and the directories and finding out where Vue is so that I can import it into my application. And it will also, when we run it, it will watch our files for any changes and restart a server for us to render the project that we're creating into a web page for us, so that I don't have to keep reloading the page every time that I make a change to my project, which is really fun. Okay, so now that I've installed the Vue CLI, you can ignore these warnings that you're getting, that you may be getting on the screen. I'm going to say Vue create client. And I'm asking the Vue CLI to create a new project for me in the directory, and the name of the project is called client. And you can just hit enter to pick the preset here. You don't have to do anything special. And then once this installs, it will have scaffolded a project for me, and I can go in there and make changes and do whatever I need to do to create my project, which is pretty cool. If you haven't worked in web development very much before or with a package manager, there is a lot of sitting around as packages install, so you're getting the real experience here. And hopefully it all just works correctly for you as it is for me. There is some configuration necessary on your machine to make sure everything works together. So if you get stuck at any point, don't feel like you're doing something wrong. There things in the JavaScript ecosystem and in web development in general can be a little bit finicky. So just keep going. And if you need to ask a question or search on Stack Overflow, usually you'll find your answer there. So we've successfully created this project called Client, and it tells me, the Vue CLI tells me that I just need to navigate to that client directory and run npm run serve. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to say cd client npm run serve. And let's remember that command because we'll come back to it later on. And what the Vue CLI has done is it's created a scaffolded a project for me, and now it's running that at as it says, the local host 8080. So sometimes that can be 8081 if that port is taken up. So just be aware of what the output is here. I'm going to open a web browser and navigate to localhost 8080. And as we see, the Vue CLI has indeed created an app for me, and it is rendering it here on port 8080 for me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my code editor, and I'm going to open that directory that we created. This might look different for you if you're using a different code editor than Visual Studio. And I'll go to coding. And where did we say that was? We said it was in MEVN character generator. I'm going to open this whole directory because we're going to add a server to this later. Right now we just have a client. And the first thing I'm going to do is take a look at my client directory and just get an understanding of all the things that live in this directory. So I have my package.json here, which if you haven't really dealt with, it's in the root directory of client, and it talks about like what is the name and the version, the author, any dependencies that I have. We'll work with this just a little bit in the server section of our code. And there's some other config files that you don't really need to worry about. The juicy bits are in the public and the source directory. We'll spend most of our time in the source directory. I just want you to see, you're probably most familiar with index.html. And all this does in our HTML file, at least in this project, it has an ID called app. And that's really all of our index.html does for us. It has an area within the HTML that has an ID called app. And that's where Vue is going to, what they call, mount our application to that ID, as we'll see in main.js. Main.js is the main entry point for our application. All it does is it imports Vue and imports our app from this file that we'll look at in a second, called app.vue. And it says we're creating a new Vue app and we want to render it and mount it on the app ID within index.html. So it serves as an entry point, and which is important, but it doesn't do much else. When I go to app.vue, and you'll see that your component, what are called components in Vue, they usually have the .vue extension. I have three main sections here. I have a template section, and that refers to the HTML that I see in rendered on the screen. So right now, if I go back to my web browser, I see there's an image tag here, and it leads to the Vue logo, and that's this Vue logo here that I'm looking at. And then I have this, which might look kind of weird for you if you haven't dealt with components before. I have this thing called Hello World with a message equal to welcome to your Vue.js app. Okay. We'll take a look at that in a minute. And that's the rest of my template. Then the next section is a script, and this is where you define the logic of your Vue application and of your components. And so here I'm importing Hello World from the folder components, helloworld.vue. That's up here. We'll take a look in a second at what that is, so just keep that in mind. And I'm exporting this app, including the component Hello World. And then at the bottom here, I have a style section, which is where all your CSS would go for a Vue app or for a component. We won't be dealing with the CSS at all in this tutorial. I'm going to leave that up to your design skills. The app we're going to create is going to be more functional than pretty. It's not really going to look like much. So you can go ahead and make it look prettier in whatever way you deem fit. Yeah, so let's just take a look at this. If I go ahead and delete this part of the template, the image, because I don't want the Vue logo in my RPG character generator, and I hit save, well, it's the Vue CLI is automatically going to compile those changes and re-render everything back on my web page. So now when I look at the web page, the Vue logo isn't there, but I still have all this other stuff. Where's this coming from? Well, that's my Hello World component in helloworld.vue. If I navigate to helloworld.vue, I see, oh, well, here's all this stuff. All of these links and the text that has been populated here in my on my screen. That's all coming from the Hello World component, which is being called by the app.vue component in the HTML like this. And also interestingly is that I have this Hello World reference with a message equal to welcome to your Vue.js app. And you'll see that that's being rendered up here right at the top of the screen. If I navigate to my hello world.vue file, I see at the top of my screen here in the HTML is this message that's being rendered right at the top. And so what Vue has done for us here is it's connected these two files by saying, hey, from app.vue, I'm going to pass you what's called props. If you've worked with React before, this will be a similar concept to you. I'm saying there's this thing called props, which is the message that I'm sending to you. As props, I'm sending you a message that's welcome to your Vue.js app. And hello world.vue, which is the child component of this parent component app.vue, it is receiving props. If we look at the script section, it's receiving the props and it's expecting message. It doesn't know what message is, but it expects message to be a string of some sort. It's going to be like a phrase in quotation marks or a word. And the way that Vue allows you to display what code right in the middle of your HTML is with these double curly brackets, and it's saying up here, I don't care what the message is, just display it up here. I'm receiving props from the app.vue component, and I'm displaying it up here as a message or as HTML, and so that's how that works together. So not much else to say here other than at the bottom, we see here the style section where you would put your CSS. It says style scoped, and there's a helpful comment here that says add scoped attribute to limit CSS to this component only. So if you wanted to create a component within Vue that only has like all the text is pink, for example, versus your main app, which all the text is orange, you could do that and say that I just want to scope the CSS of this component specifically. I don't want it to affect other components or the app as a whole. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete everything. I don't want any of this. I don't want any of this HTML here. I need to keep the div attribute though, or the div tags. So I'm going to delete all this here. I'm going to change the name of this component to character viewer. And again, you can call this stuff whatever you want, but if you're going to follow along, it probably would be easy to just call it what I call it for now. I'm going to delete the props because I'm not using that just now. Saving all this. I'm going to change the class of this to character viewer, even though we won't be using it, just because I'm OCD. Okay, so I've saved that. We'll notice that when we go back to our website, there's nothing here because we've deleted everything. And I'm going to change the name of the component to character viewer as well. So I know that what I'm working with, I should say. I don't know why this isn't viewing the whole way, but that's okay. There we go. That's better. And that means that when I change the name of this component, I also need to go into app.vue and change the name of the component there too. So I'm going to import character viewer from the components directory character viewer. And when I export app, I also need to export the component character viewer. Great. Now here I have this reference to hello world. That's old and I don't need this message anymore. So it's nice that Vue has scaffolded this app for me, but I don't need any of the actual specifics of it because I'm going to create my own. So this is going to be called character viewer. Okay. And I don't need this favicon. I also don't need the logo or the assets directory for this, so I'm going to delete them. You know, they're helpful to have if you are trying to do images. You just already have your assets directory, or you can even just leave them there. But I'm kind of OCD about that as well, so I delete it. And now I have nothing. I literally have nothing on my web page. So before I really move too far forward, what I am going to do is I'm going to add in the character viewer section just a little phrase that says character viewer, and I'll save it. And now when I look at my website, I I just see character viewer. So that means that I'm doing something correctly, like I haven't broken anything. And if you're worried that things aren't working, or if it doesn't look like things are working, there are two places you can look. One is in your command line interface where the Vue CLI is running. Sometimes it'll throw an error here for you if you've like left a comma somewhere there shouldn't be, or you missed a semicolon or whatever. It'll let you know. Or if that's working properly but nothing's rendering on your page, you can open up the console and you'll see any errors here on your console. I'll just leave it open for us to look at. Okay. Next step. now that I have a character viewer, which is where I'm going to view all the characters that are eventually going to be populated in my database, I'm going to copy this or just duplicate this character viewer component. I'm going to change its name to character creator.view, just like that. And in the character creator, open it up, make sure I'm editing the new file, not the old one. I'm going to just change names here to character creator. Could probably just find all of them and replace all of them at once, but whatever. Changing the names to character creator, nothing special here. Okay, and now I'm going to reference this component in my app.view. So I have my character viewer here, and now character creator, and I've done something wrong here. I haven't imported it, so it doesn't know what I'm supposed to do with it. Import character creator from same file path, character creator dot view. And actually, before I save this, let's just look at and I have to export it as well. Before I actually save this, let's just look at what error is being thrown so we get an idea of how to read it and how to understand it. So here I don't see any errors in my CLI, but I do see in the console section of my web page that views warning, it's unknown custom element character creator. Did you register the component correctly? So this was before I asked Vue to import the character creator component and then exported it with my app. So now when I save it, it should render correctly. Sometimes you have to reload the page for the console to refresh, or just refresh the console. So I have character viewer and character creator. Both are being rendered by Vue using this app. Something that I don't love is sometimes when I create a new project, it doesn't like the tabs don't work all correctly. So at least in Visual Studio, I can just go to Edit, Advanced, and say Format Document, and then everything's tabbed perfectly. And that feels good to me. Let me just do that in each of these files because it will drive me absolutely nuts. There we go. Not sure why that's not a default, but what can you do? Maybe it is in your code editor. Okay, so that's great. So the website shows us this. It shows us the two components, one on top of the other. But I want to dynamically view the content. I want a way of switching over from the character viewer to the creator back and forth as necessary. And I want to be able to do that without having to go to a different page. I just want that all to live on a single page app. And Vue is really great for this kind of stuff. I could, just thinking it through, I could create radial options so that when I click on one option, it takes me to the character viewer, and if I click on the other one, it takes me to the character creator. But I kind of like working with buttons. I feel like it provides for a better user experience. So I'm going to create a couple buttons, and I'm going to attach some Vue stuff to it so that it makes it provides logic for what should happen when a user clicks on those buttons. And to do that, we're going to go into the app.view section of our app, which I'm not in. Now I am. So I under this section where it says div ID app, that's going to be the main. That's going to house all of my HTML for this particular component. I'm going to add a button, and I'm going to say v-on click equals toggle equals another quotation character dash viewer, and then I'm going to say for the text of this button it's going to be view all characters. So I'm saying this button, I've created a button. I can save it. I look at it. I have this view all characters button that I created. And before explaining exactly what it does, let me just create another button. And I'm going to call this button VON click equals toggle equals character creator. And I'm going to say create a character. Okay, now I got these two buttons. It's worth noting that here in this attribute called VOnClick, I'm putting double parentheses on the outside and a single parentheses on the inside here, and we'll see why in just a second. When I go down to the script section, something we haven't seen yet, we've seen that there's a name of the app that's being exported, or the component that's being exported. We've seen the components that it's including in its export. Now we're going to add a section called data, and that's going to be a function. Oops, I spelled function wrong, and that's messing me up. And that function is going to return an object. Okay. Let's type a little bit more, and we'll see where this will take us. And we're going to say set toggle equal to character dash viewer. Okay. So the way that view components work is that you have a number of things that you can put in this export default section, where we saw we saved props in it that we sent to another component earlier when we were working with the hello world .view component. We also have a section called data, and data is anything that you want to store that's local to the app that needs to be used at some point in your application. So right now, what I'm doing is I'm creating a almost like a stateful piece of data here, where I'm saying that I want to create a variable called toggle, and that toggle should be set to a string which is called character viewer. I could set it to something else. I could set it to a different name. I could set it to a number, like an integer. I could set toggle to equal to 0. There are many different ways to define how your data looks. Right now I just need a toggle that is set to character viewer, and I'm saying in this button on here to view, when on the click of this button, when someone clicks this button, I want you to set view. I want you to set toggle, which is referring to this toggle down here in the data section. I want you to set that toggle to the string character viewer. So when I click view all characters, set toggle to character viewer. Whereas if I set the toggle, if I click create a character, set the toggle to character creator. So that's great. I mean, it doesn't do anything right now, but I've at least created this structure to say when I click these buttons, do different things. That's the logic. And now when I look at my character viewer and character creator component references here, I'm just going to add a little phrase here that's going to help us close the circle on that logic. And here I'm going to say character viewer v-show equals toggle equals character viewer, or character dash viewer. And character creator v-show equals, and it you'll see I have the double quotation marks here, toggle equals single quotation mark character dash creator, end single quotation mark. So in these component references, I say view, show this component if toggle is currently equal to the phrase character dash viewer, and view, show the character creator component if toggle is equal to character dash creator. So now when I save it and go back to my web page, I see I only have rendered here the words character viewer or the character viewer component. And when I click on create a character, it moves over to my character creator component. So I can click back and forth, and now I have a dynamically rendered web page based on user input. That's actually pretty cool. It's pretty simple right now, but Vue does a really good job of making these types of tasks pretty streamlined. And there are different ways of doing this that you can look into within the Vue documentation. But this is one simple way of getting a dynamically rendered web page up and running. Great. I need to do a little bit more work so that I have some more exciting stuff to look at. So I'm going to go to my character creator, and I'm going to add some fields here so that the user can start creating their characters once we've got our database up and running as well. So under my my character creator, I'm just going to add some HTML here, and I'm going to say label for character dash name, character name, space, and then I'm going to add an input of type text, and the ID is going to be character name, character dash name, and I'm going to use this vModel directive equals name, and the placeholder will be enter a name. And a couple of breaks here. Okay, so I see this, and I go to my website after I've saved it, and I get a couple of errors here because it says that property or method name is not defined on the instance but referenced during render. That just means that I've said use this vModel directive, but I haven't actually done anything with it. So what I need to do here in the export section is add a data function here, which you'll recall returns an object. And here I'm going to say name is just nothing right now. But now that should go away. Great. So what I've done here is I've created an input. If I navigate to my create a character section, I've created an input section. It's called, it has a label that's called character name. And this input is a text section, so I'm expecting to enter text in this section. And it has a vModel called name. vModel just means that I want to link this this input to the data called name. So this data variable within the object of data that's called name, that's where this input should point to. And I've just added a placeholder that says enter a name. Now that should mean that I'm enabling my players to be able to enter a name for their role-playing game characters. And in this very simple app, I'm going to give them a way to also enter a profession or a class. So we'll just say that we'll have a drop-down menu that allows them to choose from a mage and a thief and a warrior. So let's create that now. We'll create a label for our professions list, and we'll say it's called character profession space. And we'll create a select, which is our drop down. The ID's name is going to be the same thing, professions list. And the vModel, and we're referring to our data, is going to be profession. We need to add that to our data section. Okay. In fact, let's do that now. We have a name. Because it's an object, we need a comma, and we'll say profession. And that will be nothing right now, just an empty string. I hate that I have different types of quotation marks in my app. Okay, so let's add 3 options. We'll say in one of the option, the value is equal to mage, and we'll display that as mage. The second option will be a thief, and we'll display that as thief. And the third option will be warrior, and we'll display that as warrior. I made a typo here. It's not value, it's value. And okay, so I've done that. Let's see how that looks. That looks great. I mean, it's not pretty, but it works. And when I click on this drop down, I can see what's going on. Great. The only thing I need to do here, I mean, I don't actually need to do anything. When I select any of these options here, it should populate this profession data with whatever value is in the option tag. But I want to just display that for my own peace of mind to know that it's working. So I'm going to say here, I'm going to use those double curly braces, and then I'm going to say name and profession. And when I save it, now I'll enter a name, and I'll say, let's say Iskander. And as you can see, it's dynamically rendering that data as I enter it into this input. And I say that Iskander is a thief. Well, it displays it right here because I've referenced the name and profession variables within the data object here right in the middle of my HTML template in between these curly braces. So if I change Iskander's profession to a mage, it does that dynamically, which is pretty cool. At least I think it's cool. Okay, great. So that looks pretty good. And when I move over to the view all characters component, I still don't have anything to look at, but that's simply because we haven't, created any characters yet, and I don't want to mess with this just yet until I start working with my backend. But when I go to the create a character portion or component, I have this header. I have a place where people can enter a name for a character and then choose a profession for it. You can add to this as you like. You can change it all around and do something else with it, but this is the basic functionality of the front end of our app. Right now we're rendering this dynamically on the page, whatever the choices are, but we're going to do away with this and make it more interesting in terms of its functionality when we're able to save characters and then view them by accessing a database. That means we need to go into the server portion of our app, which is a really exciting time to go get a drink or take a bio break and come back and we'll be ready for you. So let's move to the back end. I'm going to start by just closing up this client section for a second, but I want you to keep your Vue CLI running because we're going to be coming back to it. We're actually going to open more of these command lines, so get ready for that. And let's do that, in fact, right now. Let's open a new command line. This might look different for you, as I mentioned before, but as I'm using Visual Studio, I just do everything through here. I'm in the MEVN character generator root directory, and I'm going to make a directory called server. And that helpfully is now right next to my client in here. And I'm going to say, I'm going to go into the server directory, and I'm going to say npm init. I want my package manager to initialize the server. And here, I'm just going to press enter a bunch of times because I don't want to change the version number or the description or anything about this. Just keep pressing enter unless you want to edit this stuff. And that creates a, if I look over here, that creates a package JSON file for me, which doesn't have anything that I need to work with just at this moment, but we will in a second. And now that I've done that, I'm going to install our dependencies that we need for the backend of our app. Unlike the front end, which we really just installed the Vue CLI. And what's great about the Vue CLI is that it just packages a bunch of stuff, a bunch of dependencies that we need. And we don't have to do that. This part is going to be a bit more piecemeal as we have to do it ourselves, but it won't be too bad. We'll say npm install -- save express.environment or .env nodemon or nodemon, I don't know how you say it, mongoose cores. We're saving a bunch of stuff to our dev environment as dependencies, each of these things are worth looking into in their own right. Express is the main backend framework that we're using to build our server architecture. .env is a way for us to set up environmental variables, which I highly recommend looking into. They help us set up things like paths for where our database lives and other stuff. We're not going to use it too much, but we will use it for one key component. Nodemon or nodemon, or I don't know how to say it, watches our server for changes and will restart a server for us, so we don't have to do that. Similar to what the Vue CLI is doing for our front end. Mongoose is what's called an ODM that helps us to map our data onto the database, which is MongoDB. If you haven't worked with ORMs or ODMs before, that's another thing worth looking into, but I'll show you how to use Mongoose in this tutorial. And then cores is a little thing that will help us not be frustrated by running the client and the server on the screen. If you look up cores, you'll see that it is something that is blocked by most web browsers for security concerns. Essentially, if I'm going to be running a client on localhost 8080, and as we'll see in just a second, I'm about to run a server on localhost 3000. Those are two different URLs, so to speak. If I try and make a request from my client to my server, that request is going to be blocked because they're not on the same URL. And to enable that resource sharing, I need to have this cores dependency that allows me to do that. It's basically a pain, and having installed cores, we won't have to deal with it. If that's all you want to know about it, that's all you need to know about it. But there's a whole rabbit hole waiting for you if you're interested in looking into it, as I have. Just trying to save you time. So in our code editor, we're going to create 4 files. And at least in Visual Studio, the way that I do that is I add a new item and I say I want it to be a JavaScript file. I could really just add a file, but whatever. I'm going to call this server.js, and there's nothing in it. I'm just going to copy this 3 times and call one of them just .env. That's our environment file. No JS at the end of that, just .env. I'm going to call one characters.js and the other one single character.js. We'll use each of these files in turn, and if you've worked with backend architecture at all, you'll see that I'm doing things a little bit unconventionally in terms of the file paths for this stuff. That's just for ease of use, and I'll explain where I'm doing things differently as we move along. And when I go to, before I go to write any code, I'm going to go into this package JSON file and find the area that says scripts. And here I have a test script. I'm going to replace that test script with the following. I'm going to say dev should be nodemon. I'm just going to call it nodemon for the rest of the tutorial. How about that? We can agree on that. Server.js. This just means that when remember before with the client we ran npm run serve and it served up a web page for us. In this script, I'm going to say when I say npm run dev, it's going to run a simple script that says nodemon server.js. That's saying nodemon, I want you to load this file called server.js as the entry point, and watch my files for any changes and restart the server if I make those changes. Okay, great. So let's create our server. We'll go into the server. You can delete any boilerplate comments or whatever, and say require .env .config, require that .env dependency, which our configuration is going to live in that .env file. We're going to create a constant, a variable called express, which is equal to the express dependency, our main framework that we're using for backend web development. We're going to assign a constant server to express, and we got to use that cores thing, so let's require cores. Cool. So now we have everything we need to get our app up and running, except we have a spelling mistake. Okay, so our server use express.json. We're going to be using JSON we're going to be parsing JSON as part of our HTTP requests from the client to the server. Let's use the built-in functionality of JSON in Express. And let's also make our server use cores. If you tried to do this without cores and then come back, you'll definitely thank me. I pulled out a lot of hair trying to get my apps to work before I understood the use of it. And then we're going to say server get root directory request and response. We'll make a function. The response should send the phrase hello world. And another plug here, I should really just recommend that you check out some of the articles that I'll post in the description section. A lot of my own work and the way I structure my apps and my own learning have been deeply informed by some of those articles written by some of our colleagues in the field. And they're just wonderful tutorials. And if you want to know about how some of these things tick or why you do some of these things, I definitely point you towards those articles because they have heavily influenced me. And I'm deeply grateful for the learning that I got from them. So in this case, we're doing a very simple, we're defining the logic for a very simple HTTP request. The four basic requests that you'll see are get, are put, post, and delete. And we're only going to work with get and post, meaning we want to be able to get information from an HTTP endpoint, and we want to be able to post or to create at an HTTP endpoint. But if you wanted to update or delete things, you'd also have to work with these HTTP requests. Another thing for you to put on your reading list if you haven't done so already. The main thing to get from this code block is that we're saying when the server receives a GET request at the root directory at let's say localhost, it's going to receive a request and it's going to have a response. And the response should be for us to send back up the chain the phrase hello world. And after this, we're going to say, server, I want you to listen on port 3000. And when you do, log to the console, server started, exclamation point. And note that when I say console here, I mean my my command line console, not the console in the web browser. That's being dealt with by the client. Here, the console that I'm talking about is this command line interface. Okay, so that really should be it for my server, actually. So I'm going to run that script that we talked about, npm run dev. There's an error here. I'm missing a script called dev. Let's see what that means. That's most likely located in my package.json. And I have a, under my script, I have a dev script. I wonder what that's referring to. Missing script dev. I'm in the server file. And this is great because it gets me to check out what it is that I'm missing here. I've called the script. Oh, you know what I haven't done? I haven't saved my package.json file. Let's try that again. Okay, now we're working. So awesome. That's a great way to just learn to save your files regardless of what you're doing. So no big deals there, but I'm actually glad that happened so that we can see that NPM has thrown an error for us and we're able to work around it. Awesome. So server started. What that means is I have my my localhost 8080, which is where the client is running. I'm going to open a new web page and go to localhost 3000. And I see that what's happened behind the scenes here is my web browser has made a GET request to the localhost 3000, which is where the server is listening. And the server has received this request, processed it, and sent back up the chain the words "Hello World." Awesome. My server is running correctly because I saved my package.json. And now I can move forward and if you want to take a break now from after setting up the basic architecture for the server, you can do. Otherwise, the rest of us will open a new command prompt or a bash terminal or whatever you're doing. And I'm going to navigate to my server directory just for fun. And I'm going to type in MongoDB. And this is... I recognize that this is a pretty big presumption that you've already installed Mongo as your database and you've configured it so that it's working properly on your machine. The first time I did this, it definitely took me some tries to get it working right. And a couple of things that I ran into is that when you install Mongo, you have the choice to run it as a process in the background. I didn't do that, and what I had to do is add, I'm running a Windows machine, if that's not already evident. What I had to do is I had to go in and add Mongo to the path of Windows so that whenever I type in Mongo or MongoD in my command line interface, it knows what I'm talking about. Otherwise, it'll just throw you an error and just say, like, I don't know what Mongo is. What are you talking about? So I had to do that. And Mongo defaults, when you run MongoD to get your database up and running, it defaults to a database on your hard drive that is located on the C drive in the directory data/db or something like that. And if it doesn't find a directory there, it throws you an error. You can go to the Mongo website and look at the installation, and every time you call, if you type in MongoD, you could specify that, no, my database lives elsewhere, but that's kind of tedious. And I think you can actually change the default to something else. I didn't really look into it that far. All I did was I just created a folder on my hard drive, on the C drive, just called data/db or something like that to get it up and running. And then it worked fine after I'd done that and added it to my path. So long story short, it may take you a little bit of time to configure Mongo, and I would highly recommend that you do that before doing any of this stuff because it can be frustrating. Maybe if you run it as a process, it's already like just paying attention to what your computer's doing, so you won't have to do any of this thing that I'm talking about. So I may have made it hard on myself, but your mileage may vary. The key thing to note here is that we're running 3 command lines. One of them is running our client, the other one is running our server, and this third one is running our database, and then I don't have to look at the database anymore. I'm just going to let it run in the background. Cool. Now I finally get to use my environment file. I'll go into it. I'll delete any code that's already in there. And I'll say in capital letters, database underscore URL is equal to MongoDB / localhost / characters. I'll save that. And that's really all I need to do with my environment file. I'm just declaring where's my database URL and what how do I want my application to use that, my server to use it. You can use it for a lot more things. We really don't have need of it of .env for anything else in our app, so we'll just leave it there. But it can be very useful for working on your paths. Going back to the server.js file, under the declaration of course as a constant, we're going to start using Mongoose, which, as you remember, is our ODM for working with MongoDB. We're going to start by importing or requiring Mongoose. And we're going to say mongoose.connect process.environment.database underscore URL. That's what we just defined in the environment file. And you have to add this line of code: use new URL parser true. The caps does matter. The capitalization does matter for a lot of the stuff that we're doing. So if for some reason you have a hard time reading any of this stuff, please just go to the GitHub code repository that I've linked in the description section, and you can look line by line and make sure that everything's exactly correct in your app as it is in mine, just in the case that things aren't working for you. We're going to say constant db is equal to this Mongoose connection, just so we have a better, an easier way to reference our database. That's basically, DB is basically our database. And we're saying to our database, if there's an error or on error, comma, take that error and log it to the console. Console.error, error. Oops, not length. Looking for a semicolon. And then, hey database, once the database is open, call this function. Log to the console that we're connected to database. Yay! Okay, so we've set up our database connection through Mongoose. We're saying that let's import Mongoose, create a constant called db, which is equal to the Mongoose connection, and then if there's an error, let us know what that is. But once the database is open, log to the console that we're connected to the database. Okay, and there's an issue here that I'm seeing in my console, in my command line, that it says Mongoose error, the URI parameter to open URI must be a string, got undefined. Make sure the first parameter to mongoose.connect is a string. And I see that mongoose.connect is the process environment database URL, and I look at my env file and I say, well, okay, that looks like it's correct. It's passing in this MongoDB localhost characters string, but what's going on here? And then I realize that it's because I've named my env file incorrectly. You probably can't see this on your screen, but for some ridiculous reason, I have it as comma env instead of .env. When I change it to that, everything should be working properly now. Yeah, the server restarts because it notices changes, and I get these two comments. The server started and it's connected to the database, which I've asked for it to do here. Server started and connected to database. So now that's set up correctly. It was just, a typo, which can sometimes be the meanest of errors to understand and parse through. Great. So now that everything's wired up in that respect, I've got my database connected to my server, and I'm getting the responses that I've been looking for. I need to add a Mongoose, what's called a schema. A schema is a model of what your data should look like, and will map the data that we're receiving from our client onto our database, which is the MongoDB. So in character.js, I'm going to create this schema that Mongoose is going to use as the kind of the middle person in between our server and our database. I'm going to say I'm going to require Mongoose, and I'm going to say I'm going to create a constant called character schema and make that equal to a new Mongoose schema. And just recalling what we did in the front end, we created a character name and a character description. We want to do that the same thing here, and we'll say not a description, I'm sorry, a profession, whether they're a mage or a thief or a warrior. And we're going to say in this schema, their name is of type string. So we're expecting to get a string from the name that we're receiving from the client. And we're saying required true. They must supply a name for this to be mapped onto the server to the database correctly. And we're going to say add to that object a profession of type string, and it's required. You can do a lot more with your schemas and make them much more complex and fleshed out than this, but we're just going to keep it simple for the sake of this tutorial and say that that's all we need in our schema. We need a name and a profession. Both are strings and both are required. And we'll export this schema by saying mongoose.model parentheses character, or the character model, and base that off of this character schema that we've just written. All right. Great. Now we need to wire that up further. We need to tell the server how to access the database and what to do once it's working with the database. And I think we've done enough in this server file, server.js, without it getting too messy. So we're going to delete a little bit of the code here and move it to our characters.js file, just to keep things a bit more clean. What that will require us to do is to delete this get request logic, and instead we're going to say constant called router. We want it to require this characters file. And we want the server to use I'm going to explain this backward. So we create a router, which is called, which is requiring the characters plural.js file over here, and we want the server to use that router when a user goes to the characters endpoint on our URL. So before we were saying whenever a person goes to the root directory, just localhost 3000, we want to send them a message that says hello world. Now we're saying that, well, whenever anyone navigates to the localhost 3000/characters URL, or what's called an endpoint, we want to use the characters directory to determine the characters file to determine what should happen there. And we'll define all of our HTTP request logic in that file. Now is a good time to mention that this is where I'm doing something that's not really a best practice. I'm keeping all these files in just one server folder. Ordinarily, you'll have more than one model for your data instead of just character.js. Maybe you're making quests as well, or you're making player characters and non-player characters, and you'll keep each of those in different models. And that will be, you'll put that into a models folder, and you might have different routes. Like if someone comes to the characters endpoint, you might have a route for that and call that characters.js. You might have a route for quests.js, and just all different routes that you'll be using. In that case, you'll create a routes folder and put your characters.js and other, files that are related in that folder. And then that will mean that you'll reference them differently here. When you say require /characters, you would say /routes/characters, for example. Structure that as you like. Usually that's seems to be the best practice of how people do it. Right now, for simplicity's sake, I'm just keeping them all in the same folder. If I go to my characters file, delete the boilerplate, I'm going to just create a basic routing service here, and I'm going to say constant express is equal to requiring express. So I import express into this file. And I'm going to create a constant called the router, and that's a new instantiation of the express router. And I'm going to say router get pretty much the same code as we had before. There's a request and a response. And the response should send the words, "Hello world." And then I want to export this router. So I basically just ported over my code from the server directory. It looks a little bit different because I'm using the router as it's a separate file, separate way of doing things than when I was just working right in the server itself. And the one thing that I want to point out to you is that although it looks like I'm saying when someone navigates to the root directory, when I receive a GET request from the root directory, because this is being called by server.js, and what's happening is the server is defining logic for when someone navigates to the characters endpoint. In the characters.js file, this supposed root directory is actually localhost 3000/characters. It's not localhost 3000 like we were dealing at the very beginning of this server part of the app. This root directory, I'm using quotation marks or air quotes as what you can't see right now, is actually referring to the characters endpoint that we defined here in server.js. Which means when I save my files and I make sure everything's running right in my my console, I can now navigate to localhost. If I reload localhost 3000, I don't have anything here anymore because I moved the endpoint from just the root directory to characters. So I'm going to go to localhost 3000/characters, and now I see my hello world comment. So that means that I have done that part at least correctly. So now we need to think about exactly what do we want to do when we receive requests from the client to the server in terms of interacting with the database. The server is going to act as an API, or an application programming interface, between the client and the server so that we can make a GET request from the browser that says, hey, get me all of the records or all of the items that are in the database. And we also want to be able to post items to the database, or that's a different way of saying we want to create items in the database. In our case, we want to create characters that have a name and a description that go along with them. So for doing that, we're going to return to our server, server.js. I should say, actually, we're going to go into our characters.js, which is where all of our routing is, and we're going to flesh out this get method with some stuff that's going to help us to define the logic for what should happen when the client makes a get request from the server that will eventually get to the database and be sent back up the chain. So right now we have router get at the root directory, which you'll recall is actually at localhost 3000/characters. And we're going to change this into an asynchronous request. You might want to just do a Google search for what an asynchronous function is in JavaScript, but basically it just means that we can do things asynchronously without necessarily having to do everything happening all at the same time. And we have a request and a response, and within this code block, we're going to delete this hello world line, and we'll say try, and we're going to create a constant called characters, and we're going to say await character dot find. And we're going to respond with a JSON that has those characters in it. So this means that when we run this asynchronous function, we're going to try to create a constant called characters, and that characters constant or variable is equal to waiting for the database to find each item in the database that matches the character model that we've created, the Mongoose character schema that we've created. And we want to send a response in JSON of those characters. If there's an error, then we're going to catch that error. This is called a try catch block. And we're going to respond with a status of 500. And in JSON, we're going to put in a message that's equal to the error message. That's it. So we're creating an asynchronous function that when it receives a request, it attempts to find all the characters in the database that fit our Mongoose schema called character. And it will send them all back up to the stack, back to the client as a JSON response. If something goes awry, well, then it'll send a 500 error instead. Great. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to reload this page, and I will see that it says character is not defined. That's simply because I've forgotten one thing, a very important thing, at the very top of the code, is that I have to define or declare what this character is. And as we know, it is the character schema that we've discussed and created. Okay, now that we've imported it, we can reload. And although it doesn't look like much, there's just empty brackets. This actually is a really big success for us because it means that when we reloaded the page, the browser made a GET request to that endpoint, the characters endpoint, and when it made that request, our server went into this router and it performed this asynchronous request, and it tried to search the database for anything that matches the character schema that we created in Mongoose, and respond with everything that it found. Now, it didn't find anything in the database, so it returned an empty array, which is what we're looking at here. But we also didn't get an error, which means that it works successfully. It's just that we haven't populated our database with anything just yet. That's pretty cool. Actually, that means we're doing a good job. If you want to take a break now, now's a good time. Otherwise, we're going to wire the front end and the back end together. The first thing we need to do, and you're not going to believe me when I say this, is to open another command line. And that's simply because we've got our client running on one, we've got our database running on another, we've got our server running on yet another one. But we need to install one more thing to help us wire the front end and the back end together. So we're going to go into our client directory, and we're going to type in npm install -- save it to the dev environment, Axios. Axios is a package that allows us to make HTTP requests from within our client. You can check out the Vue documentation or Axios documentation to see exactly how it does that or what it does. And I should also say that what we're doing right now, we've built a front end and we've built a back end, and now we want to get them to communicate with one another. So we're using Axios to do that. If you're just interested in running a backend server, or you're creating an API and you're not interested in working with Vue beyond this tutorial, you could use a third-party app like Postman, for example, which allows you to make all kinds of HTTP requests to a server or to an API without having to have a front end. It just allows you to make those requests from within your browser or within the app without creating a client that does that for you. We're kind of making it more complex because we're making a full stack app. So back in our character viewer file, we need to make our GET request to the server so that we can pull characters from the database. And we'll do that using Axios. So I'm going to go back into my client. I'm going to go back into character viewer. And this is what it looks like right now. We haven't touched this since we set it up. What I'm going to do here is at the top of my script, I'm going to import Axios from the package that we just installed called Axios. And I'm going to create, I need to create a data object here. Well, data is a function that returns an object. Return. And in the object, I'm just going to create a variable called characters, and I'm going to set it to null. These are going to be the characters that we pull in from the database. I'm going to add another item here called methods, which is a built-in item that Vue supports for any methods or functions that you want to use throughout your Vue app or component. And I'm going to declare a get characters function. This is the function that's going to get characters from the database, or at least send the HTTP request to my server API. And this function is going to call Axios. And I want Axios to first send a GET request to HTTP localhost 3000 characters. That's the same endpoint we've been using. And then I want it to take whatever response that it gets and store that in the characters variable. All right. Before we move forward, let's just talk about what this does. I've created a method within this methods object that Vue provides for me. It's called getCharacters, and it's what I want. It's the function that I want to run when I'm trying to get all the characters from the database. And within the function, I call Axios to send a GET request to the characters endpoint, and then I want it to take whatever response it gets and store that in the characters variable that I created earlier. You'll notice that I say this.characters because if I just say characters, when view runs, it's not going to know what characters is because you'll remember this is a component that's being imported into another component. So we want to say, when I refer to characters, I'm talking about this component itself, this version of characters. And I set it equal to the response that I received. And actually, I sent it to the data of the response because the response that the browser is going to receive has a bunch of different stuff in it. You can actually just log it to the console at some point or look up an example, and you'll see there's a lot of stuff in there that we don't really need. We just need the data of the response. And even that will be more than we need, and we'll have to clean that up. We'll see that in just a moment. Finally, under the methods object, I'm going to add a mounted function that says I want to run this get characters. Mounted just means when this component is mounted, run the function get characters. And I meant this function that exists in this component, in this instantiation, I want you to run get characters. So as soon as the component is mounted, run this function and get all the characters from the database. I save. Let's see if I have any errors. Actually, I can close this this terminal because I don't need it. I don't see any errors in my console. Let me check my client here. Everything looks good. If I reload, the component is mounted and I'm in the character viewer and nothing's happening, but that's not a bad thing because I've set everything up. It might be working properly. I won't know until I populate the database, which is why using Postman could be useful, or some other third-party app to test the API first. But because I'm not being thrown any errors, I have a sense that this is working properly. It's just that I don't have anything in my database, which means that I need to now create a post request and determine what is the logic when the browser is trying to add a new character. So let me go back to my server, and I'll go into my characters.js router, and here I have my get request. Underneath that, I'm going to add logic for a post request, and I say router post, and this is at the characters endpoint. I'll make an asynchronous function. And we're going to do another try catch, but first we need to create a constant called character. I'm going to make that equal to a new character, big C character, which you'll recall is our mongoose schema. That's a new character in which the name that is expected by our mongoose schema is equal to the requests, the name that's in the body of the request, similar how we segmented out the response data, because the response from an HTTP request is very long, has a lot of stuff in it. We just want the data. In this case, we just want the name that's in the body of the request that's being sent to the server API. Same thing with the profession. The profession that is defined by the mongoose schema should be equal to the request body profession. So when we get a request, take the name and the profession from the body of the request and assign that to this new character schema, this new character model that we've created. And once we've done that, try to create a new constant called new character, and that's equal to awaiting character.save. That's our way of saying, when you say .save, that's our way of saying save a new item to the database. In our case, it's this new character that we've created based on the Mongoose schema. And respond with a success status of 201 with a JSON of this new character that we've created. Now, if there's an error, catch it. Whoops. With a response status of 400. And a JSON of the error message. Okay. Great. That's our post method. So when the server receives a post request from the browser, it should do this. It should create a new character in the database and respond with a status of 201 with a JSON of the new character. If not, we'll get an error. Okay. Right now, we've essentially wrapped up the back end of our app. We have our server that that sets up the architecture for how we want things to work. We have a .env that will that just helps us with a little bit of our paths. We have a database that's running, and we are using Mongoose to create a schema to map our data requests onto the database. And we have a characters.js router that manages our get and our post requests. If you're planning to move on after this tutorial and attempt to do a patch request, if you want to make updates or a delete request, if you want to delete characters, this is where that information will be saved. So that's definitely something to look into as your own further research. I'm going to pop back into my character creator because that's where we're going to be doing the work of posting requests or creating new characters. And we're going to tie everything together let's delete this name and profession because we don't need that anymore. That was just like duct tape so we could see if our front end was working correctly. And let's do this. We need to, at the top of our script, because this is a different component than the other one we imported Axios, we'll import Axios from the Axios package. And in the export section, we're going to change this data around just a tiny bit. Like we did in the character viewer, we're going to set name to null and profession to null. They don't have anything in them from the beginning of the when the component is first mounted. And then similarly to the other component, the character viewer component, we're going to add a method section. And in the method section, we're going to create a post character, which is similar to the get characters function in the other component. Post character is a function, and in it we're going to call Axios, and we want Axios to, instead of getting something, we're going to ask Axios to post to the same endpoint, HTTP localhost 3000/characters. And we need to tell Axios what it should do when it gets there, when it makes that request. When it makes the post request, it should include an object where the name is equal to this dot name and the profession is equal to this dot profession. Let's just look at how that all works together. In our router, we're creating a new character based on the Mongoose schema, where we're expecting a request that has in its body a name and in its body a profession. And now in our character creator file, we're making a post request and we're providing a name which is equal to this.name. Remember, we're talking about this component here, and this.name is referring to the data called name, which is right now null. And the profession is also null. So we're saying the profession that we're providing in the request body is this.profession. This profession here that exists in this data object. Right. And that's about it for this component that when we think about the script portion of it, we're pretty much done there. But now we need to, I mean, if we look back at the app itself and we go to create a character, we still don't really have a way to post that character. We need to add that functionality to this component, and that's pretty easy to do. All we need to do here is at the bottom, under the drop down, create a couple of breaks to give us some space to work with. We'll add a button, and we'll say to view, on the click of this button, when someone clicks it, I want you to run the post character function that we created. And we'll give it a name, say create character. Okay, so when this button is clicked, it'll run this post character method. Take a look back at our app, and now that's appeared here. So now, if everything is wired up correctly, we should be able to type in a name. Let's type in the name Iskander, for example, and we'll say that Iskander is a thief. I click create character. Let me check my my scripts, my command lines. I don't really see anything interesting here. So now when I have created a character and sent that post request, when I go to view all characters, reload the screen, I don't see anything here. What's going on? Well, one way that I can troubleshoot is if I go back over to my characters endpoint and reload the page, well, I get this response, which tells me that the server is definitely working, and I have this really nice array with an object in it that says it has an ID of the data that I've requested. It has the name of Iskander, which we've asked it to create, and a profession, which is thief. Well, that's great, but it's not working for my app. Why is that? Well, for a very simple reason, is that I haven't asked my app to display it. I changed the character viewer. Where are we? I changed the character viewer here and added all the logic to it, but I didn't add anything for the person to view it, which is a relatively simple thing to do. All I have to do here is, like we did in the other file when we were looking at the name and profession to make sure that it was working, I'm going to add double curly braces and I'm going to say characters. I'll save it. And now when I go back to my web page, it's reloaded the page for me, and I have under my character viewer, I have the characters, which is the same as this endpoint here. So I'm not going to say the app is complete because this isn't the way that I would want to serve up this information, but everything's hooked up correctly. We went over here, we created a character. Let's create a new character. We'll say her name is Vashka, and her character profession, let's say that she's also a thief. And we create a character, we make that post request, we go to view all characters. It doesn't show up quite yet, but if I reload the page, it'll make another get request, and now I see there are two different characters here. There's Iskander, there's Vashka, and they're both thieves. That's pretty good, actually. That means that it's all wired up correctly, and my get requests are working, my post requests are working. That's all working properly. I need to do a little bit more work to make this a bit more clean, but I'm happy that the full stack is running the way that I want it to. So there's some different ways to clean this up, but I'm going to suggest at least one of them. If I go back into my character viewer, I'm going to add a little bit of code that's gonna help with what we're trying to do here. And instead of just displaying this character's object that we've created, we're going to add a v4 directive here. And v4 is like creating in Vue. It's like creating a for loop that sits right in the middle of your HTML. So v4 equals character, comma, index in the character's object, and vbind equal colon key equals index. Talk about what that means in a second. We want to iterate over that object and say display the character name, and then add a little text, is a character dot profession. Okay. Elements in iteration expect to have vbind key directive. Oh, this auto-populated this for me, which I don't need. Okay. So now that we've done that, it says Eskander is a thief. Vashka is a thief. So we could change that around as much as we want, but the point is that we've extracted the key data from our response data, which is the name and the profession, and made them a little bit more visually appealing. Not that much more visually appealing, but at least I can parse this. And the way that we're doing that is we're using this v4 attribute to say, I want you to iterate over the character's object, which is initially equal to null, but you'll remember when this component is mounted, it runs this get characters function, which makes an Axios get request and responds, and the response is the data of the response is stored in this character's variable. So for every character in this character's variable, I want you to display the character name and the character profession. And we're just saying character.name is a character.profession, so that the person who views this can have a better way of looking at it than just these data objects. And Vue is a little bit finicky about this. It wants you to have a unique key for each of these things that you iterate over. And so we're just saying set that to the index of each of the objects in the variable characters. So characters is, the index for the first character is going to be 0. The index for the second character is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. So just use that index as the key if you need to have a unique key for each of these items. It's just something you got to do when you're working with Vue and working with loops. So when we have all that put together, then we have a nice looking little web page that does this. There are a couple of outstanding issues, like, for example, when I create a character, let's create a new character. We'll call her Alina. And let's say Alina is a mage. I create a character, I go to view all characters, and she doesn't show up here. I have to reload the page, and then it works out that it says Alina is a mage, and it refreshes that. One workaround, for example, is that see, we call get characters when the component is mounted, and that happens when you first load the page or when you reload it. So we could, for example, just add a button here, and we call VOnClick, run the get characters function, and we let the user know that they can refresh characters by pressing that button. So that shows up here. And now I create a character. We'll call this person Belinda. And let's say that Belinda is a warrior. Okay, now I'm here. The component has already mounted, so it doesn't refresh. But I click refresh, and it runs that function, and now everything's looking pretty good. So that looks pretty good, and it's fully functional in that respect. We can go over to create a character and do so, and then we view all the characters by making our get request. But there might be an even more elegant way to solve this issue where we have to click this refresh characters button every time. Because of the way our app works, whenever we create a character, we have to go over to this component. And whenever we want to see all the characters, we go over back to this component. So what if we could tie all this logic to this button up here so that we don't have to put the onus on the user or the player that's creating characters to click this button every time? We can do that very easily by going back all the way back to our app.view, and we'll add a little bit of logic here and a little bit of information up top in our HTML template. And essentially, we're just going to rewrite some of the code that we've written and delete it from the character viewer component. What we need to do is import Axios, and this will be a good review, from the Axios package. We're going to keep our components the way they are. In the data function, we're going to add a characters variable, which is initially set to null, just like we did before in our character viewer component. And we're going to add a method section, which has our get characters function. It's pretty much the same stuff as we've gone through before. And in it, Axios is going to perform a get request to localhost, our old friend, localhost 3000 /characters. That's our endpoint. And then it's going to respond. It's going to take the response and store it in this .characters. Not the whole response, you'll recall, just the data of it. And then like we did before, when this component is mounted, run this function, get characters. Okay, great. So the logic is there. Now let's add it to the HTML. We've got our buttons, which are working just fine for now, but we also needed to add this get characters function to the very first button. You'll recall that when I create a character, I'm working in this component. Then when I click this button up here, view all characters, I want to run that get characters function so that it populates all of this stuff behind the scenes before the player or the user is able to look at it. So I have this button. It already has vOnClick. Toggle should equal character viewer. Within this, the double quotes, I'm going to put a semicolon to let it know that I want it to also do something else. I want it to run get characters, the get characters function that I've created. And then in the character viewer component reference down here, I remember I'm taught when I'm asking view to show this component when the toggle is equal to character viewer. I'm going to add this line here which says characters equals characters. That might seem a little bit redundant, but what it means is that when I reference this character viewer component that is only shown when the toggle is equal to character viewer, I want to bind the character's object here, the character's variable, I'm going to bind that as props for the child component character viewer. So that's a long way of saying when I call this character viewer, send along the chain this character's variable, which should contain the data from our response from the get request. So just send that along the chain because I know this character viewer component is going to use that. And then in the character viewer component, I need to delete a bunch of stuff because I don't need any of these methods or mounted or anything before. Actually, I don't even need the data because I'm not working with the data. What I need is to add, as you recall, when we first looked at this, or at least one of these, I think it was this component, it was the hello world view, and it was receiving a message as props. I'm going to recreate that, and I'm going to say the props, it should expect a props called characters, and that characters is going to be array. It expects, when it's called, it expects a props called characters, and the type of props is an array. It's the array that we see that has a lot of data objects in it, which are our characters. So when this component is mounted, and when it's called by the parent component, which is app.view, it should expect props, an array that is called characters. And then up here, when we have this v4 iteration, or the for loop, we really don't have to do much with it because it's already referring to our character name and character profession. All that we've done is removed the get function, or the get method, from this component and put it into the app component, and are requesting all of the data from the server API in this component, and then sending that along to character viewer so that it can display it. Now everything's saved. I go back to my web page, and it says Axios is defined but never used in character viewer.view. That just means that in my character viewer.view, I removed the get method here, but I forgot to delete this reference to Axios, importing it. The view CLI will be helpful in that respect. Sometimes it might get on your nerves, but it's trying to be helpful in saying, like, hey, you called this, you imported this Axios thing, but you never used it. Okay. Now when we go back, we have our website working just really well. We're going to add a new character. We'll call this character Thogron, and we'll make him a warrior. Now I've created my character. The real test is when I move over to the view all characters component, it should have called my made my get request to the server and requested all of the characters that are in the database, and should already be viewing them because this button up here, we've attached the get characters method to that button. So let's see. Well, it didn't work. I still had to press refresh characters. Let's see what we did wrong there. Love it when we hit the moment of truth and we haven't done it correctly. It's the life of the developer. Let's see. So in I suspect it has something to do with what we've done here at the top with the HTML. So let's see. We've said on click, I want you to change the toggle to character viewer, and I want you to run get characters. Let's see where we've gone wrong here. When I say get characters, I've created a function that does my get request, and it seems to only work right now when I click this button, which is in the get characters button, the refresh characters button, which I forgot to delete from here. So let me just go ahead and do that while I'm here. And then when I go to my app.view, that seemed to still be working. I wonder if it didn't reload from the get-go. Let's see what happens now that we've done that. I reloaded it, and now there's no button there. I'm going to create a new character and call him Carthax. And let's say Carthax is a mage. I create him. I go to my view all characters, and it's created my character for me. Huh, that's a funny one. It's like I maybe view didn't reload the page or something weird happened, but now it's working as intended. when I create a character, let's do another person. Let's call him Gloric. And Gloric is a mage. I create a character. Okay, returning to the moment of truth. I have this view all characters button, and it should be the only way that I can make a get request without having to reload the page. So when I press this button, it should change the toggle to the view character, the character viewer component, and it should make my get request to the server, which will in turn get all of the characters from the database and send them up the chain to display on screen. So Gloric the Mage should appear here, and there he is. And we have it. We have successfully created our full stack app, role-playing game character generator that allows us to make get requests to a server API that in turn pulls data from a database, a Mongo database, and we also can create new characters by posting, making an HTTP post request to the server. There are some outstanding things that you could still do here. The first one that jumps out at me is the design of it. You could add your own CSS to this project so that it looks a lot nicer and it's prettier, or it's better themed for the type of role-playing game that you're making. You could change some of the fields. You could add to the schema and say like, okay, I have a character name and a profession, but I want races too. I want to have dwarves and trolls and elves, or whatever you wanted to add to this. You could add the functionality, as I've said before, to patch or update or delete characters from the database, which will have you working with their IDs and different endpoints. So there's a lot still to do, and I would highly recommend taking your code or cloning the Git repository and working with that code to kind of like break it and see what you can create, see what you can make. And please feel free to share your projects with me and let me know what you found and what's worked for you, or if you run into any issues, please feel free to reach out to me and you can comment here on YouTube, or you can get at me on Twitter and just let me know what you find. I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, please be sure to like it and subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my books and games, and please do check out the articles that I've linked in the description section that may help you with your own research and your further development as a developer. You can also check out the article that is a companion to this video if you want to check out some of the nuances of some of the stuff that I've done here. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.